So, who's better at managing the economy, Labor or the Coalition? Really is a terrible question. I mean, maybe that's a little unfair. It's probably less the question, but more so the debate that it inspires that's terrible. Nonetheless, it's a debate that just won't go away, and it always seems to ramp up the closer we get to an election. This means that there's a better than average chance that we're going to be repeatedly smacked around the ears with one of the Coalition's favourite catchphrases.
The Liberal Party will always manage the economy more effectively than Labor can.
Now, the reality of the matter is that there's no evidence that supports this claim. It doesn't matter how many times the line's repeated.
The Coalition will always manage the economy more effectively than the Labor Party.
Really though, hats off to the Liberal Party's PR and marketing teams because they did a great job of selling this myth years ago to the extent that it still exists to some degree today. If you're worried that this video is just going to be some cheerleading propaganda arguing that Labor are superior managers of the economy, don't stress, that's not what this is about. It might be controversial to say, but I reckon that the reality is that when it comes to economic management, arguing one party is better than the other has about as much merit as arguing Star Wars is better than Star Trek. Sure, governments can make good and bad economic policy decisions, but the performance of the economy is often driven far more by external factors outside the government's control than political ideology. I guess though that's provided the government of the day can avoid going full Trump. Which is not always a given these days, I guess. I reckon that when thinking about the federal budget and how well a government has managed the economy, we need to move away from simply focusing on the bottom line, surplus or deficit. Personally, I believe the yardstick for how well a government has managed the economy is best viewed through the decisions they've made to arrive at their destination. I say this because too often you'll see reporting focus on the bottom line, that surplus or deficit figure, and viewing that as a measure of whether or not a government is doing a good job. And indeed, governments place a lot of emphasis on that figure too. But I believe that focusing on this figure alone as a measure of whether or not a government has managed the economy well can be largely meaningless, because the bottom line is often influenced far more by factors outside the government's control than it is by any government policy. Think stuff like commodity prices or a pandemic. Let's take a look at a couple of practical examples to hopefully make things a little clearer. Labor's first budget of this term in October 2022 forecast a budget deficit of almost $37 billion. By mid-2023, that deficit had been transformed into a $22.1 billion surplus. This was largely driven by higher than expected commodity prices for things like coal and gas, due to increased demand from China and global supply disruptions due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Had it not been for the increase in commodity prices, the budget would likely have remained in deficit, as had originally been forecast. And those commodity prices, they had nothing to do with the government's economic management, and everything to do with being in the right place at the right time. And there are plenty of similar examples from the red and blue teams if you trawl back through history. We also need to remember that the bottom line surplus or deficit figure does not account for off-budget spending. Off-budget spending is a bit of an accounting trick. Off-budget spending occurs when a government labels spending as an investment instead of an expense. Think basically anything the government announces with the word fund attached to it. This artificially improves the budget bottom line, since investment costs are not included in the underlying deficit or surplus figures commonly reported by the media. This off-budget spending does, however, add to gross debt. So the government borrowed $10 billion to start up the Housing Australia Future Fund. Thanks to some accounting wizardry, that doesn't contribute to the surplus or deficit. It does add to the country's debt though. Both sides have been doing it to varying degrees for years, making a bit of a mockery of this figure that politicians and the media fixate on. And they will fixate on it. Here's David Spears on Insiders.
The budget bottom line we saw during the week, yes, you had two surpluses, but then we're back in deficit, and deficits really for the next decade. Is this why you can't do any more on things like defence?
If you put up a graph of what we inherited when we came to office,
we can't keep looking back.
They would have been. Look forward, David. They would have been red the whole way down. 78, you would have needed to have extended this graph because it only goes to minus 50.
This is where we are.
We inherited minus 78, and the 2024-25 deficit that currently is $27 billion was almost double that. That was the anticipation.
So is that enough?
Every single one of the every single one we have taken forward, whether that be taking big Liberal deficits, turning it into Labor surpluses, or taking very large Liberal deficits and making them smaller.
And the PM is right. There are deficits year after year. But that doesn't really tell us a great deal. I'd hazard a guess that had Labor been in power for that period, they'd have been running deficits for the most part as well. We also need to be honest here. Labor have benefited from a change that came into effect from the 2020 to 21 budget onwards that has allowed earnings from the Future Fund to contribute toward the budget bottom line. As many of the Coalition stenographers have pointed out, perhaps had this change come in earlier, the Coalition may have run a surplus or two in their past couple of terms as well. And to be fair, that may well be true. But again, this really just points to the fact that simply looking at these numbers as surplus or deficit and suggesting that they tell us much at all about how well a government can manage the economy is a little bit silly. So what about debt? Well, with all the Coalition squealing, you'd think Labor were the only team to accrue debt. It's not true. Both major parties have given this a fair nudge. It does need to be made clear, though, that when it comes to debt, while the Coalition like to try and lay the responsibility for the $1 trillion of debt at the feet of the Labor Party,
Their $1.2 trillion of debt.
the suggestion that it's solely a Labor-created issue is a total fallacy. Both parties have played their part, and the reality is that even outside of the pandemic, the Coalition did more than their fair share when it came to running up a tab. And debt levels often really have more to do with economic cycles than the economic management of the government of the day. That said, though, I'd like to see off-budget spending contribute to the bottom line, because maybe it might make the government of the day put some more consideration into some of their spending and election promises. The reality is that when it comes to economic management, the dollars and cents of it all, the two major parties have fairly similar goals. At a high level, they both aim to maintain sustainable debt and deficit levels, aiming to reduce deficits over time. They both favour a market-based economy. They both rely on the Reserve Bank to manage interest rates and inflation, and they give the Reserve Bank independence to do this, which also gives the political parties both someone else to point to when interest rates and inflation aren't going the way the public would like. And when it comes to government policy, while the two major parties may differ in where their policies are targeted, it's incredibly rare for any policy either party puts forward to dramatically alter the fundamental structure of the economy. It's more like tinkering around the edges of an established system. So here's what I reckon. Arguing about which party manages the economy better is stupid. When people argue a case for one side versus the other, they tend to focus on the big ticket items we've looked at: budget bottom line, surplus or deficit, debt. These sorts of arguments are best reserved for those who follow political parties as if they were a sporting team. I find them a little bit dumb because at the end of the day, these arguments generally overlook the major part of economic management that really matters, and that's the choices a government makes. I mean, do you want a government to subsidise long business lunches, or would you prefer that they choose to further subsidise healthcare? Would you prefer a government deliver a massive surplus, or a far smaller one whilst at the same time raising the rate of job seeking? So there's a few things to take away here. The first is, anytime you hear a Coalition talking head spout this,
The Coalition will always manage the economy more effectively than the Labor Party.
please understand that it's a total myth. Anytime you hear someone argue one team is better than the other while pointing to charts like these, please understand that this is only a tiny part of the story. And finally, please understand that a government's ability to manage the economy should be measured more by the decisions they make along the way than by simply looking at the bottom line.